Hello and welcome back to Israel with Aline, and welcome to our Easter special. Today we will follow the steps of Jesus and his disciples. Discover where they walked in their last days, exactly what they did, and even what they ate at the Last Supper. So if you're ready, let's get started. In the Bible, it is written that Jesus' disciples asked him where they should prepare the Passover. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus and asked him, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" But at that time, what did it really mean to prepare for the Passover and its meal? So there were 6 main steps that they needed to take to fulfill this ordinance. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to follow these steps to prepare the biblical Passover, follow the disciples' steps, and end today at their meeting with Jesus at the Last Supper. Firstly, what was the Passover then? Couldn't they be remembering the death and resurrection of Jesus if the disciples didn't even know that this was going to happen? When they talk about the celebration of Passover, they are referring to the Jewish Passover, which commemorates the end of slavery in Egypt and the Exodus. The Bible commands that the day the people leave Egypt will be a day of remembrance, a feast of the Lord as a perpetual statute. And this was one of the 3 times of the year that the men of Israel needed to go up to Jerusalem and its temple. We see that Jesus and his disciples precisely go up to the city this week. But we also see in the Bible that there are many other people who are not from Jerusalem who had also come especially for Passover. For example, Simon of Cyrene, the man who later helps Jesus carry the cross, he was from Cyrene. Cyrene is where Libya is today, in North Africa. He really makes a gigantic journey to get to Jerusalem. Another example is Joseph of Arimathea, who is from Arimathea, another city here in the region of Judea. And we know that Jesus came to Jerusalem for Passover since his childhood. He went up with his family every year. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. When he was 12 years old, they went up to Jerusalem according to the custom of the festival. And Jesus also went up to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover during his ministry. So, from the preparations for the biblical Passover celebration, the first one they had already fulfilled, which was precisely to go up to Jerusalem. And the second step they needed to fulfill was to purify themselves. For it is written that anyone who was impure could not eat the Passover meal or enter the temple of Jerusalem. And precisely the remains of the temple of Jerusalem we see here behind. This gigantic wall is the outer western wall of the Jerusalem temple complex. But how was this purification done? The purification was done through a ritual immersion bath called mikveh. And here around the Temple of Jerusalem, in the archaeological excavations, what was found? What was found here were more than 100 mikvehs, all of them dated from the time of the Second Temple of Jerusalem, from the time of Jesus. And one of them is right here next to us. Let's go in to take a look. We are going down for purification. But notice that there is a partition on the stairs. Why is that? because people would descend unclean, purify themselves in the waters, and then ascend on the other side. This is not any kind of handrail, but rather a partition, so that by mistake, a pure person would not touch an impure person and thus become impure as well. People would enter here into the waters for a complete immersion, and they did this while they were completely naked as they came into the world, and that's why the mikvehs, we believe, were separated between men and women. So the second step before one could eat the Passover was the purification. And now we move on to the next place. The third step was to remove all the leaven from your house or the place where you were staying. This means that you could not, for example, have bread at home. For 7 days you will eat unleavened bread. On the very first day, remove the yeast from your houses. For anyone who eats anything with yeast in it from the first day through the 7th day will be cut off from Israel. The next step is to bring a lamb to sacrifice at the Temple of Jerusalem. Just as we said, the temple is right here beside us. However, this lamb had to be bought several days in advance. It had to be kept at home from the 10th day of the month of Nisan until the 14th, which was the day of the sacrifice. So what we need to do now is buy a lamb. However, where in the times of Jesus could we find a store that sells lambs and animals to be sacrificed? Right here. This was a big shopping street, and what we see next to it are preserved shops. These are original shops from that time. We're not exactly sure what each of them sold, but surely on this street you could buy lambs. So imagine that we buy this lamb here and take it home to wait all these days. We can see here the original staircases that gave access to the Temple of Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. You can see that the stairs go up towards that gate. That over there is a small part of the Huldah Gates complex. There was a double gate there, and on the other side a triple gate. And so, when the day of the Passover sacrifice arrived, thousands of people climbed these stairs, carrying their animals. And this same path we are going to take now by climbing the stairs. On the Temple Mount, the animals were sacrificed, the blood thrown at the base of the altar, and the rest of the animal prepared, so that it could be taken home. All this while the Levites sang the Hallel Psalms, which are Psalms 113 to 118. And since we are living this experience together today, I would also like to listen to one of these psalms with you. So, let's now listen to the Hallel Psalm sung by Yair Levi, who is a Levite. And the fifth step was to take the sacrificed lamb home to roast. However, Jesus did not live in Jerusalem and had no house here. So where was the lamb taken? Where did they prepare the meal? In the house of a certain man, as it is written in the Bible. And on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" Then Jesus sent two of his disciples, telling them, "Go into the city. There a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow that man and tell the owner of the house he enters that the master asks, 'Where is my room in which I will eat the Passover with my disciples?' And he will show you a spacious upper room, furnished and ready. There make the preparations." The disciples went to the city, and found everything as Jesus had told them. They prepared the Passover. And we are also now going to this certain man's house. Let's make our journey from here to Mount Zion. And have you noticed that as we study the history and customs of Israel, we understand the Bible much better? The Last Supper itself gains a completely new aspect when we realize all these details, and in a little while we will talk even more about what exactly was on their table. Here we already see the entrance to the upper room. We know that the Last Supper took place in a family home, more specifically on the second floor, in a large furnished hall. This also shows us that this family was a wealthy family, a rich family, because they had a house of at least 2 floors. And now come with me, because we are going to go up to the upper floor. We are already on the second floor of this house, and we also see here in the background the entrance to the room itself of the cenacle of the place of the Last Supper. And they bring here the lamb that had been prepared in the temple, but they now need to roast the lamb over fire. And of course, they weren't going to light a fire in the middle of the room, but rather the fire was lit in some external area. It could be a slab like we are. It could be in some external courtyard. We really don't know exactly where it was roasted, but we are absolutely sure that yes, the lamb was roasted. And then they take the roasted lamb along with the unleavened bread and also the bitter herbs. And this was the 6th and final step. Prepare the supper, put everything that is necessary on the table. And what is necessary? First, the roasted lamb. Second, the unleavened bread. This bread in Hebrew we call matzah. It's a bread that has not been fermented, and this one follows exactly the same recipe since biblical times. It is also known as the bread of affliction because it represents the affliction of slavery in Egypt and also the affliction of the quick exit to freedom. And also for this reason, it is not fermented because our ancestors had to leave Egypt quickly and did not have time to let the bread ferment and rise. In addition, besides the matzah and the lamb, the maror is necessary, as we call it in Hebrew. These are the bitter herbs and also the wine. And with all this, they would go in to prepare the table, so come with me. We can see that the room these days is completely empty. But when the apostles came here to prepare the table, the room was furnished. We don't have a table to lean on now, but we'll leave our things here on the side and understand what kind of furniture was here. Because when I continually talk about the Last Supper, what comes to mind for many people is a long table, that image of Leonardo da Vinci, with everyone even sitting on the same side of the table. But this image of Leonardo da Vinci is completely wrong. The Last Supper's table was not a long table, but rather a U-shaped table. We don't exactly know where it was placed, especially since these columns didn't exist at that time. But imagine that somewhere in this room was a U-shaped table, and sitting in the middle of it was Jesus. And it wasn't a table of today's height, but rather it was a low table. Why? Because they didn't sit in chairs. The tradition of the Passover meal at that time was to sit in a reclining manner. Do we hear this in the Gospels themselves? When the time came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table. We just heard that they were not sitting at the table, but they were reclining at the table. The idea of being reclined is that it was a symbol of freedom. And another name for Passover in biblical times was Hag Akarut, the Feast of Freedom. Again, recalling the end of slavery and the Exodus. And so they sat here around a low table on the floor cushions, and they then reclined on these cushions. Was everything then ready? Everyone sitting at the table, happy, celebrating another Passover meal? But only Jesus knew that this would be his last supper. At dusk, Jesus was reclining at the table with the 12. And while they were eating, he said, "I tell you that one of you will certainly betray me." They became very sad and began to say to him, one after the other, "Surely it is not I, Lord," Jesus affirmed. "The one who has eaten with me from the same plate will betray me." Then Judas, who would betray him, said, "Surely it is not I, Master." Jesus affirmed, "Yes, it is you." As we heard, Jesus knows that it will be his last supper. He foresees the betrayal. He also foresees Peter's denial, which really happens a few hours later, when he was imprisoned in the house of Caiaphas. And Jesus, knowing everything that would happen to him, he goes to the table and he takes the bread and the wine, the unleavened bread, as we spoke, and he says the following words. And he said to them, "This is my blood, the blood of the New Testament, which is shed for many." Jesus breaks the bread and gives them the bread and the wine and teaches them to do this in memory of him. See how interesting about the table. There was also lamb and bitter herbs, but he just chooses the bread and the wine to be his eternal memory. And this teaching is followed to this day by Christians all over the world, every week when the supper is celebrated. And I hope you guys have enjoyed getting to know a little more deeply the traditions of Jewish Passover and the Last Supper.